Krelnox sat in the observation deck of the Valtherian vessel, watching the human colony below through the viewing screen. The colony was called New Terra, and it looked small and unremarkable. Humans had only been traveling between stars for 5 years, and the Valtherians had been watching them for most of that time. Krelnox's job was to study these newcomers and report back to the Valtherian collective about whether they would become important in galactic affairs. So far, the answer seemed to be no. Humans were interesting but not impressive. Their ships were slow compared to other species. Their weapons were simple. Their technology was at least 200 years behind the Valtherians and most other spacefaring races. The Galactic Council had welcomed them with polite interest, the way one might greet a child at an adult gathering. Humanity was allowed to join the galactic community, but nobody expected them to matter very much. Krelnox had studied 17 different species in a long career spanning 3 centuries. The Valtherians lived much longer than humans, and Krelnox had seen civilizations rise and fall. Most new species followed predictable patterns. They either integrated peacefully into galactic society or stayed isolated in their home systems. Some grew aggressive and had to be contained. A few destroyed themselves before reaching the stars. But all of them were understandable. All of them made sense. Humans were different, though Krelnox couldn't quite explain how. There was something in the way they talked, the way they built their colonies, the way they looked at the stars. It was like they were hungry for something. Not resources or territory exactly, but something else. Experience, maybe. Or challenge. Krelnox had noted this in earlier reports but couldn't quantify it properly, so the collective had dismissed it as speculation. Everything changed 3 days ago. The Xanthir Empire had sent an official communication to Earth. The message was simple and direct. The Xanthir claimed that New Terra was in a resource zone that belonged to them. They demanded that humans abandon the colony within 30 days. If humans refused, the Xanthir would take the colony by force. The message ended with a warning that the Xanthir fleet consisted of 200 warships and that resistance would be futile. Krelnox had expected humans to negotiate. That was what sensible species did when facing superior force. The Xanthir Empire controlled 17 star systems and had won every war they had fought in the past century. They were not cruel by galactic standards, but they were proud and powerful. Most species backed down when the Xanthir made demands. It was simply logical. But the human response was not what Krelnox expected. Within 6 hours of receiving the Xanthir ultimatum, every human colony had activated something they called emergency protocols. Military vessels that had been scattered across human space began moving toward defensive positions. Civilian ships started returning to human-controlled systems. And strangest of all, the colonies themselves began to change. Krelnox watched New Terra transform over the next 72 hours. The colony had 20,000 residents, most of them miners and their families. Before the ultimatum, it had been a peaceful place focused on extracting rare minerals from the planet's crust. Now it looked like something else entirely. Mining equipment was being converted into weapons. Large drilling lasers were removed from their industrial housings and mounted on defensive platforms. Cargo ships that normally hauled ore were being fitted with missile launchers. The colony's fusion reactor, which had been running at 40% capacity, was pushed to 85% to power new shield generators. Even the civilian population was involved, working in shifts around the clock to fortify their home. Krelnox sent a message to the colony's administrator, requesting permission to observe more closely. The administrator was a human named Jack Morrison, a former military officer who had retired to colonial service. Jack agreed to the observation and even invited Krelnox to tour the colony's operations center. The operations center was crowded and noisy. Humans were everywhere, talking rapidly, moving equipment, checking systems. Jack Morrison stood in the middle of it all, calm and focused. He was a large man with gray hair and steady eyes. When Krelnox arrived, Jack nodded in greeting but didn't stop working. "You're here to watch us prepare for war," Jack said. It wasn't a question. The Valtherian collective is interested in understanding human responses to crisis situations. Krelnox replied carefully. Jack smiled at that. It wasn't a happy smile. "You want to know if we'll fight or run. Will you fight?" Krelnox asked. "The Xanthir have 200 ships. You have perhaps 20 in this entire sector. The logical choice would be to negotiate or relocate." Jack turned to look at the Valtherian observer. "Logic says we should run. History says we'll fight. Krelnox didn't understand. Your history is not relevant to current military realities, isn't it? Jack walked to a display screen showing the colony's defenses. My species has been fighting since before we had words for it. We fought with rocks and sticks. We fought with swords and spears. We fought with guns and bombs. We even fought with nuclear weapons that could have destroyed our whole planet. We've spent most of our existence at war with each other or with our environment or with anything else that got in our way. That sounds exhausting, Krelnox said. It is, Jack agreed. But it's also who we are. When someone tells us we can't have something or that we need to give up something that's ours, we don't think about logic. We think about all the times in our history when our ancestors were told the same thing and they said no. We think about the fact that we're here, talking on a planet that's not Earth because our ancestors refused to accept limits. Krelnox was beginning to feel concerned. This was not normal behavior for a species facing superior force. You believe you can win? Jack shook his head. I believe we can make them regret coming here. There's a difference. Maybe we hold the colony, maybe we don't, but either way, the Xanthir are going to learn that humans don't surrender just because the odds are bad. They're going to pay for every meter of ground they take. They're going to lose ships and soldiers. And when they're done, they're going to think very carefully before they threaten another human colony. A young woman approached with a data pad. Her name tag read Claire Hudson, and she was covered in grease from working on machinery. Sir, we've got the mining lasers operational. They're not military grade, but they'll punch through light armor. We're also setting up the decoy satellites. If the Xanthir scan the system, they'll think we have 3 times as many defensive platforms as we actually do. Jack nodded. Good work. What about the civilian evacuation? Claire hesitated. 70% of civilians are refusing to leave. They want to help with the defense, Krelnox was shocked. You would allow non-combatants to remain in a war zone? We don't force people, Jack said. Everyone here is an adult. They know the risks. If they want to stay and fight for their home, that's their choice. Over the next 2 weeks, Krelnox watched New Terra prepare for war. The transformation was remarkable and disturbing. This wasn't a military base. It was a colony of miners and farmers and shopkeepers. But they were all working together like a military unit. They shared information freely. They volunteered for dangerous tasks. They pushed themselves past exhaustion. Krelnox interviewed several colonists, trying to understand their motivation. One conversation stood out. A woman named Claire Hudson was installing weapons on a civilian transport when Krelnox approached her. Why do you fight? Krelnox asked. You could evacuate. The Valtherian Collective would grant you sanctuary. Claire looked up from her work. Her hands were bleeding from handling sharp metal, but she didn't seem to notice. My grandfather fought in World War II. That was a war on Earth a long time ago. He was at a place called Normandy. 5,000 ships crossed an ocean to fight against an enemy that had conquered half of Europe. A lot of men died that day, but they won. My father fought in the Mars Rebellion when the colonies wanted independence from Earth. He was on the losing side, but he said he never regretted fighting for what he believed in. Me? I joined the Colonial Defense Force when I was 18. I served for 10 years before I came here to be an engineer. War is in my family. It's in all our families. When someone threatens our home, we don't run. We fight. That's what humans do. Krelnox sent another report to the Valtherian Collective that night. The report detailed human preparations and included an analysis of human psychology. Krelnox concluded that humans were more aggressive than initially assessed, and that the coming battle would likely be more violent than the Xanthir expected. The response from the collective was brief and dismissive. Many species talked bravely before facing actual combat. The Valtherians would continue to observe and record, but they did not expect the outcome to be different from any other conflict between an established power and a minor species. Krelnox looked at the stars and felt uneasy. Something about this situation was wrong. The humans were not behaving rationally, but they also didn't seem afraid or foolish. They were preparing for war with the calm efficiency of people who had done this many times before. It was disturbing to watch. The Xanthir fleet arrived at the edge of the New Terra system, exactly 30 days after their ultimatum. Krelnox watched from the observation vessel as 200 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel. They were impressive to see. The Xanthir built their ships large and intimidating, painted in dark red and black. Each vessel bristled with weapons. The flagship was a massive dreadnought called the Crimson Fang. 3 times the size of the largest human ship in the system. Admiral Zarthok commanded the Xanthir fleet. He was a decorated officer with victories in 3 previous wars. The Xanthir broadcast a final message to New Terra, offering one last chance to surrender. The message was cold and formal. The humans had 1 hour to begin evacuation, or the Xanthir would open fire. Jack Morrison responded personally. Krelnox listened to the transmission with growing disbelief. "This is Administrator Jack Morrison of New Terra Colony. We reject your ultimatum. This world belongs to humanity. We built this colony with our own hands. We will defend it with our lives. If you want this planet, come and take it." The transmission ended. There was silence for several seconds. Then Admiral Zarthok gave the order to advance. The Xanthir fleet moved forward in perfect formation, a wall of warships advancing toward the planet. Krelnox expected the human fleet to meet them in traditional formation. That was how space battles were fought. 2 fleets would face each other, exchange fire, and the side with superior numbers and firepower would win. But the humans didn't form up. Their ships scattered in different directions like insects fleeing from light. Several disappeared behind New Terra's 2 moons. Others dove into the asteroid field that ringed the system. A few headed toward the outer system at maximum speed. Admiral Zarthok was confused. This looked like retreat, but it was too organized. He ordered his fleet to split into 3 groups. One would bombard the planet from orbit. Another would pursue the human ships into the asteroid field. The third would hunt down the vessels fleeing toward the outer system. That was when the battle truly began. The Xanthir ships approaching the planet suddenly found themselves under attack from multiple directions. The defensive platforms that Krelnox had watched the humans build opened fire. Mining lasers that had been disguised as communications arrays came online. Missiles launched from hidden silos on the planet's surface. The Xanthir shields held, but they were taking damage from unexpected directions. Then the decoys activated. Dozens of fake sensor signatures appeared across the system. The Xanthir sensors showed human ships where there were only transmitters attached to asteroids. Every time the Xanthir fired on a target, they wasted ammunition on empty space or worthless rocks. In the asteroid field, the Xanthir squadron hunting human ships found themselves in a nightmare. The humans knew this field. They had been mining it for 2 years. They knew every rock, every gap, every hiding place. Human ships would appear from behind an asteroid, fire missiles, and disappear before the Xanthir could respond. When the Xanthir tried to follow, they found mines waiting for them. Crude devices, really. Just explosive charges attached to rocks, but effective enough when a ship traveling at high speed couldn't avoid them. Krelnox watched a human captain named Greg Palmer execute a particularly brutal tactic. His ship was a converted ore hauler called the Dancing Bear. It was slow and poorly armed, but Palmer used it like bait. He broadcast a distress signal claiming his engines were damaged. 3 Xanthir destroyers broke formation to capture what they thought was an easy target. Palmer led them deeper into the asteroid field, his ship limping along, leaking atmosphere. The Xanthir closed in for the kill. Then Palmer's ship suddenly accelerated to full speed and dove behind a large asteroid. The Xanthir ships followed and found themselves in a minefield. 2 destroyers were destroyed instantly. The third was badly damaged and had to retreat. Palmer's transmission to his crew was recorded by Krelnox's sensors. "That's for threatening our homes. Let's find some more." The Xanthir squadron in the outer system thought they had an easy task. They were chasing 5 human ships that appeared to be evacuating. The human vessels were civilian transports, slow and unarmed. The Xanthir commander ordered his ships to destroy them quickly and return to the main battle. But when the Xanthir opened fire, they discovered the transports were not fleeing. They were leading the Xanthir away from the planet. As soon as the Xanthir fired, the transports scattered and 6 human military corvettes appeared from behind a gas giant's moon. The corvettes were small and fast, armed with long-range missiles. They fired everything they had and then retreated at maximum speed. The Xanthir squadron gave chase, angry at being tricked. They pursued the human ships for 2 hours, getting farther and farther from the main fleet. By the time they realized it was a trap, they were too far away to help. The human corvettes had led them to a second human force waiting in ambush. 4 Xanthir cruisers were destroyed before the rest could escape. Back at New Terra, Admiral Zarthok was growing frustrated. His fleet was superior in every way, but the humans refused to fight properly. They hid and ran. They used tricks and deception. They sacrificed individual ships to damage his formation. After 6 hours of combat, the Xanthir had lost 12 ships. They had destroyed only 3 human vessels. Then something happened that changed the battle completely. A human cruiser called the Defiance, commanded by a captain named Lisa Grant, was badly damaged and surrounded by 4 Xanthir warships. The Xanthir demanded surrender. Human ships were equipped with escape pods, and the crew could survive if they abandoned ship. Krelnox watched as Lisa Grant responded to the Xanthir demand. "This is Captain Grant of the Defiance. We don't surrender. Tell your families you fought bravely." The Defiance suddenly accelerated to maximum speed, straight toward the nearest Xanthir battlecruiser. The Xanthir fired everything they had, but the Defiance's engines were somehow still functional. The human ship was coming apart under the weapons fire, atmosphere streaming from dozens of holes, but it didn't stop. The Defiance crashed into the Xanthir battlecruiser at a significant fraction of light speed. Both ships were destroyed instantly. The explosion was enormous, bright enough that Krelnox's viewing screen automatically dimmed to protect the observer's eyes. When the light faded, both ships were gone. Debris from the collision damaged 2 other Xanthir vessels badly enough that they had to withdraw from combat. Krelnox was horrified. Lisa Grant had killed herself and her entire crew to destroy 1 enemy ship. It made no sense strategically. The Xanthir still had superior numbers, but when Krelnox checked the human communications channels, there was no mourning for the Defiance. Instead, there was grim determination. Jack Morrison's voice came over the general channel, speaking to all human forces. "The Defiance has set the standard. Every ship, every station, every person will fight until we win or until there's nothing left to fight with. Make them pay for every meter. Make them remember this day." The battle continued for 3 more days. The Xanthir kept trying to fight a conventional battle, and the humans kept refusing. They ambushed supply ships. They launched suicide attacks on command vessels. They used every dirty trick that their long military history had taught them. One particularly effective tactic involved a human engineer named Danny Shaw. He was stationed on one of the orbital platforms defending the planet. When Xanthir boarding parties tried to capture the platform, Danny rigged the fusion reactor to overload. He broadcast a message to the Xanthir troops inside the station, giving them 60 seconds to evacuate. Most of them made it out. Then the reactor exploded, destroying the platform and damaging 2 Xanthir ships that were too close. Danny had died in the explosion, but he had saved the platform from capture and inflicted significant damage on the enemy. Krelnox tried to understand this mentality. Dying was the ultimate failure for most species, but humans seemed to view sacrifice as noble. They had stories and songs celebrating people who died for a cause. They built monuments to their war dead. They taught their children that some things were worth dying for. By the 4th day, Admiral Zarthok was facing a difficult decision. His fleet had destroyed most of the human military vessels in the system. New Terra's orbital defenses were nearly gone. He could bombard the planet from space and win the battle, but he had lost 80 ships. 80 ships. In previous wars, the Xanthir had conquered entire star systems with fewer casualties. The Xanthir fleet withdrew on the 5th day. They declared victory, claiming they had defeated the human forces and that New Terra would be abandoned. But everyone who watched the battle knew the truth. The Xanthir had won, but they had been bloodied badly. They retreated to their own space to repair and regroup. Krelnox sent an urgent report to the Valtherian Collective. The report detailed the battle and included extensive analysis of human tactics. Krelnox's conclusion was stark. Humans were dangerous, not because of their technology or their numbers, but because of their willingness to sacrifice everything to achieve their goals. They fought like cornered animals with desperate ferocity and no regard for their own survival. The response from the collective was more serious this time. The Valtherians had watched the battle recordings. The Xanthir Empire was humiliated. They had claimed victory at New Terra, but everyone in the galaxy knew the truth. The mighty Xanthir fleet had been forced to retreat after losing 80 ships to a minor colony, with barely any military forces. Admiral Zarthok was removed from command and sent to a distant outpost. The Xanthir Emperor himself addressed the Imperial Council, and his message was clear. Humanity would be crushed completely. Within 2 weeks, the Xanthir declared total war on humanity. They mobilized their entire military, 800 capital ships, thousands of support vessels, and millions of soldiers. The largest war fleet ever assembled by the Xanthir Empire began moving toward human space. The Emperor announced that every human colony would be conquered and that Earth itself would be occupied. Humanity would learn the price of defying the Xanthir. The Galactic Council held an emergency meeting. Most species condemned the Xanthir aggression, but none were willing to intervene. War was expensive and dangerous. Besides, the outcome seemed certain. Humanity had fought well at New Terra, but they couldn't possibly stand against the full might of the Xanthir Empire. The Council issued a formal statement of concern and did nothing else. Krell requested permission to observe Earth directly. The Valtherian Collective approved the request, curious about how humanity would respond to such overwhelming odds. Krell moved the observation vessel to high orbit above Earth, cloaked and hidden from human sensors. What the Valtherian observers saw in the following weeks was both fascinating and terrifying. Earth was not panicking. There were no riots in the streets, no desperate attempts to flee. Instead, the planet was mobilizing with frightening efficiency. Every shipyard on Earth and on the Moon was working at maximum capacity. Factories that normally produced consumer goods were retooled to manufacture weapons and ship components. Universities were turning out engineers and scientists trained in military applications. Even schools were teaching older students basic technical skills so they could contribute to the war effort. Krell watched news, broadcasts from around Earth. The humans were united in a way that seemed impossible for such a young species. Nations that had been rivals for centuries were now sharing resources and technology freely. The North American Federation was building ship engines in partnership with the European Union. The Asian Coalition was manufacturing weapons in cooperation with the African Alliance. Old grudges and territorial disputes were set aside completely. One broadcast caught Krell attention. A reporter was interviewing workers at a shipyard in what humans called Seattle. One worker, a man named Danny Shaw, spoke about his motivation for working 20-hour shifts. "My son is serving on a destroyer stationed near Alpha Centauri," Danny explained. His face was tired but determined. "Every ship we build here might save his life or the life of someone else's kid. We'll rest when the war is over. Right now we have work to do." The reporter asked if Danny was worried about the Xanthir numbers. Danny shook his head. "Numbers don't tell the whole story. Sure, they have more ships than us, but they don't have our motivation. They're fighting because their emperor told them to. We're fighting for our survival. Big difference." This attitude was everywhere on Earth. Krell interviewed several humans trying to understand their confidence in the face of impossible odds. A scientist named Patricia Cole explained it while working in a military research laboratory. "You have to understand our history," Patricia said, not looking up from her work. She was designing some kind of new missile system. "Humans have been in situations like this before. We've faced enemies that outnumbered us, that had better weapons that seemed unbeatable, and we won anyway. Sometimes through superior tactics, sometimes through better technology, sometimes through pure stubborn refusal to quit. We're not afraid of long odds. We're used to them." Krell asked about the Xanthir's technological advantage. Patricia smiled at that question. "They're more advanced than us, sure. But technology isn't everything. We're innovative. We adapt quickly. And we cheat. That's what the Xanthir don't understand yet. They fight by rules. They have doctrines and procedures and traditional tactics. We don't care about any of that. We'll use any tactic, any weapon, any strategy that gives us an advantage. If something doesn't work, we'll try something else. We'll keep trying until we find what works." The human military was preparing strategies that disturbed Krell deeply. A colonel named Henry Blake was giving a presentation to planetary defense commanders. Krell managed to intercept the transmission and was shocked by what it contained. "The Xanthir think they understand warfare," Blake said. He was a lean man with cold eyes and a scar across his face. "They've won 3 wars against species that folded quickly. They use overwhelming force and expect surrender. We're going to teach them a different kind of war." Blake outlined the human strategy on a large display screen. It involved hit-and-run attacks on supply lines, targeted assassinations of Xanthir commanders, psychological warfare to break enemy morale, and guerrilla tactics that would make occupation impossible. Most disturbing was something Blake called the Scorched Earth Protocol. "If we lose a colony," Blake explained, "we don't leave it intact for the enemy. We destroy everything of value. We collapse the mines. We poison the water supplies. We sabotage the infrastructure. We make sure that conquering our worlds costs the Xanthir more than it's worth. Every planet they take will be useless to them and will drain their resources to hold. One of the commanders asked about civilian casualties. Blake's response was cold. We evacuate everyone we can. But if people choose to stay and resist, that's their right. We don't abandon our people, and we don't make occupation easy for the enemy. Krelnox was disturbed by this conversation. Most species fought to minimize casualties and preserve their worlds. Humans were preparing to destroy their own colonies rather than let them fall intact to the enemy. This was a level of commitment that the Valtherian observer had never encountered before. The human shipbuilding program was equally impressive. They had developed a modular ship design that could be assembled in weeks rather than months. The ships were not as advanced as Xanther vessels, but they were cheap and fast to produce. Human strategy was simple. Build ships faster than the Xanther could destroy them. Krelnox watched a massive shipyard in orbit around the moon. Dozens of vessels were under construction simultaneously. Human workers moved in organized chaos, assembling components, installing systems, testing equipment. The yard operated continuously with shifts working around the clock. Every 3 days, a new ship was completed and sent to join the fleet. A yard supervisor named Karen Foster explained the process to Krelnox during a brief interview. We're not trying to build ships that are better than Xanther ships. We're building ships that are good enough, and that we can make in huge numbers. In the time it takes the Xanther to build one dreadnought, we can build 20 cruisers. They might win individual battles, but will win the war through sheer production. The human economy had been completely converted to military production. Every resource was directed toward the war effort. Luxury goods were no longer manufactured. Entertainment industries had shut down. Food production was streamlined and rationed. The entire species was living like they were already under siege. But what impressed Krelnox most was the human attitude. There was no despair. People were working harder than ever, sacrificing their comfort and their normal lives, but they weren't complaining. They saw this as necessary. They understood that their survival was at stake. A teacher named Rachel Grant was interviewed about how schools were adapting to the war. We're teaching kids about engineering, computer science, and logistics, she explained. Even children can contribute by learning skills that will be needed to keep our civilization running. We're also teaching them about our military history, about the people who fought and won against impossible odds. We want them to understand that humans don't give up. The Xanther fleet was moving slowly toward human space, gathering supplies and preparing for a long campaign. They expected to reach the first human colonies in about 3 months. Human intelligence had infiltrated Xanther communications and knew their plans. The first target would be Proxima Colony, a small settlement with about 50,000 people. The Xanther intended to destroy it completely as a demonstration of their power. Krelnox sent regular reports to the Valtherian Collective, detailing human preparations. The observers' conclusions were growing more urgent with each report. Humanity was not preparing to defend desperately. They were preparing to fight a war of attrition. They were going to make the Xanther pay for every system, every planet, every meter of space. And they had the industrial capacity and the will to sustain such a war far longer than the Xanther expected. The response from the collective was concerned but still cautious. The Valtherians had existed for 50,000 years. They had seen countless wars. They understood that determination and industrial capacity were important, but superior military force usually won in the end. The Xanther had 800 ships. Humanity had perhaps 200, and most of those were newly built and untested. The math seemed clear, but Krelnox was no longer confident in simple mathematics. The Xanther fleet reached Proxima Colony exactly on schedule. Admiral Korvan commanded this assault, determined to succeed where Zarthok had failed. He brought 300 ships, overwhelming force against a small colony that intelligence suggested had minimal defenses. The attack was meant to be a demonstration. The Xanther would destroy Proxima completely, and other human colonies would surrender rather than face the same fate. But when the Xanther fleet arrived, they found something unexpected. The colony had been evacuated. 50,000 people had been moved in secret over the past 2 months. The buildings stood empty. The orbital stations were abandoned. There was nothing to conquer. Admiral Korvan was confused but not concerned. If the humans had fled, that was fine. The Xanther would destroy the empty colony and move to the next target. He ordered his ships to begin bombardment. That's when the trap was sprung. The empty buildings were filled with explosives. The orbital stations were rigged with nuclear devices. As soon as the Xanthir ships entered bombardment range, everything detonated simultaneously. The explosions were enormous, creating debris fields that damaged dozens of Xanthir vessels. 3 ships were destroyed outright when large pieces of the orbital station struck them at high velocity. Then the human fleet attacked. They had been hiding in the outer system, waiting for the Xanthir to commit to the assault. 60 human ships appeared from multiple directions, firing missiles and energy weapons before the Xanthir could organize their formation. Krelnox watched the battle from a safe distance, recording everything. The humans were using the same tactics they had employed at New Terra, but refined and improved. They worked in small groups, coordinating their attacks with precision. They focused fire on damaged ships, destroying them before the Xanthir could retreat. They used the debris from the destroyed colony as cover, hiding behind chunks of metal and concrete. One human captain particularly impressed Krelnox. Commander Julie Chen commanded a destroyer called the Relentless. Her ship was small and lightly armed compared to Xanthir cruisers, but she used it brilliantly. Chen would appear suddenly, fire a volley of missiles, and disappear into the debris field before the Xanthir could target her effectively. Over the course of 4 hours, the Relentless destroyed 3 Xanthir ships and damaged several others. The battle lasted for 6 hours. The Xanthir eventually drove off the human fleet, but the victory was costly. They lost 18 ships and had 30 more badly damaged. Proxima Colony was gone, but it had been worthless anyway. The humans had evacuated everything of value and left only a trap. Admiral Korvan was furious. He sent a message to the Xanthir command, demanding more ships and better intelligence. The humans were not fighting like a weaker enemy. They were fighting like guerrillas, striking and retreating, never committing to a decisive battle. This was not how civilized species conducted warfare. The Xanthir adjusted their strategy. Instead of attacking colonies directly, they began targeting human supply lines. If they could cut off the outer colonies from Earth, those settlements would have to surrender or starve. It was a sound plan, and it should have worked. But human supply ships didn't travel predictable routes. They moved in irregular patterns, jumping between systems in ways that made tracking them nearly impossible. They traveled alone or in small groups, making them difficult targets, and they were armed unlike civilian vessels of most species. Even a simple cargo ship had missiles and point defense systems. The Xanthir assigned hunter groups to patrol human space, looking for these supply convoys. They found a few and destroyed them, but the cost was surprising. Human cargo ships didn't surrender when confronted. They fought back. They used distress signals to call for help from human military ships. Several Xanthir hunter groups were ambushed and destroyed when they thought they were attacking helpless freighters. Krelnox observed one such encounter. A Xanthir cruiser found a human supply ship and ordered it to surrender. The supply ship, commanded by a captain named Brian Foster, responded by accelerating toward the cruiser and launching every missile it carried. The Xanthir ship destroyed the supply vessel easily, but not before taking significant damage from the missiles. 30 minutes later, 3 human military corvettes arrived and destroyed the Xanthir cruiser while it was still making repairs. The war continued for 6 months, spreading across dozens of star systems. The Xanthir won most battles, but never decisively. Human colonies were conquered, but they were always evacuated first and usually booby-trapped. Human ships were destroyed, but new ones kept appearing from Earth's shipyards. The Xanthir were advancing slowly, but the cost was enormous. Admiral Korvan began to understand the human strategy. They were trading space for time. Every battle delayed the Xanthir advance by days or weeks. Every destroyed colony drained Xanthir resources. Every ambushed supply convoy made logistics more difficult. The humans were losing territory, but they were making the Xanthir pay dearly for it. The Xanthir Empire began to feel the strain. 800 ships was their entire military force. They couldn't replace losses as quickly as humans could. Their economy was large but not geared for total war the way Earth's was. Public support for the war was declining as casualties mounted. The Xanthir had expected a quick victory, not a grinding campaign of attrition. Earth, meanwhile, was producing ships faster than ever. The modular design had been refined further. New shipyards had been constructed at Mars and in the asteroid belt. Human industrial capacity was fully mobilized, and it showed. By the end of 6 months, humanity had lost about 80 ships, but had built 150 new ones. The human fleet was actually larger than when the war started. Krelnox sent extensive reports to the Valtherian Collective, documenting this remarkable achievement. How was it possible for a species so young and relatively primitive to outproduce an empire that controlled 17 star systems? The answer lay in human culture. Humans were competitive by nature. Their economic system was based on competition. Their industries were efficient because they had been forced to compete with each other for centuries. When that competitive drive was focused entirely on military production, the results were staggering. The Galactic Council began to take notice. What had seemed like a minor conflict was turning into a major war. The Xanthir were not winning easily. In fact, some analysts suggested they might be losing despite their superior technology. Council members started having quiet conversations about intervention, mediation, or sanctions. The Xanthir Emperor refused all attempts at mediation. His pride would not allow him to negotiate with humans. The Empire would win this war no matter the cost. He ordered Admiral Corvan to take the entire fleet and strike directly at humanity's outer defensive line. A decisive battle would break human resistance. Corvan assembled 800 ships, every vessel the Xanthir could muster, and moved toward a human stronghold in the Kepler system. Intelligence suggested the humans had fortified this system heavily. It guarded the approaches to the inner colonies and Earth itself. If the Xanthir could break through here, the war would effectively be over. The human commander in the Kepler system was Admiral Richard Cole. He had 200 ships under his command, less than a third of the Xanthir fleet. By conventional military thinking, the coming battle should be a massacre. Krelnox positioned the observation vessel at a safe distance and prepared to record what might be the end of human resistance. But Admiral Cole had no intention of fighting a conventional battle. The Kepler system included a dense nebula, a cloud of gas and dust that interfered with sensors. The humans had spent months mapping the nebula, learning its every current and formation. They knew where they could hide and where sensors would be useless. Admiral Cole broadcast a message to all human ships. Krelnox intercepted and recorded it. "We're outnumbered 4-1. In a straight fight we lose. So we won't fight straight. We'll use every trick our ancestors ever learned. We'll be sneaky, underhanded, and ruthless. We'll make them think twice about every decision. And when this battle is over, the Xanthir will know that they picked a fight with the wrong species." The human fleet retreated into the nebula as the Xanthir approached. Admiral Corvan was cautious. The nebula would limit his sensors, but it would also limit the humans. He ordered his fleet to advance slowly in a defensive formation. The Xanthir entered the nebula and immediately encountered problems. Their sensors showed phantom contacts everywhere. Some were real human ships, others were decoys, simple transmitters broadcasting fake signals. The Xanthir fired on dozens of targets that turned out to be nothing but empty space. Then the attacks began. Human ships would appear suddenly from the gas clouds, fire missiles, and vanish before the Xanthir could respond. The weapons came from all directions. Xanthir ships were destroyed one by one, picked off by an enemy they couldn't see clearly. Admiral Corvan tried to maintain formation, but the nebula made that impossible. His fleet was forced to spread out to search for human ships. That made them vulnerable to ambush. Groups of human vessels would swarm isolated Xanthir ships, destroy them quickly, and retreat before reinforcements arrived. The battle lasted for 3 days. It was chaos from beginning to end. The news of the Battle of Kepler spread across the galaxy within days. The Xanthir Empire, which had seemed invincible just months before, had been defeated decisively. 400 ships destroyed. Admiral Corvan dead, half their fleet gone. The shock was profound, not just for the Xanthir but for every species in the Galactic Council. Krelnox sent an emergency report to the Valtherian Collective. The report was detailed and urgent. The observer had been wrong in the initial assessment. Humanity was not just another minor species. They were something new and dangerous. Their tactics, their industrial capacity, their willingness to sacrifice everything for victory made them unlike any species the Valtherians had encountered in 50,000 years. The Valtherian Council responded quickly this time. They requested that Krelnox appear before them to testify in person. Such a summons was rare. The Valtherians had watched the battle recordings and read all the reports. Now they needed to understand what the observer had learned from months of close study. Krelnox traveled to the Valtherian homeworld, a journey that took 2 weeks. The council chamber was vast and ancient, decorated with artifacts from thousands of civilizations. 300 Valtherian counselors sat in curved rows, Their eyes focused on the observer who had watched humanity go to war. The head counselor, an elder named Sevrax who had lived for 8 centuries, spoke first. "You have observed humanity extensively. Tell us plainly, should we fear them?" Krelnox considered the question carefully. Fear is perhaps not the right word. We should respect them. We should be cautious about how we interact with them. And we should absolutely avoid making them our enemies. "Explain," Sevrax requested. Krelnox activated a display showing recordings from the war.
Humanity is dangerous not because of their technology, which is still primitive by our standards.
They are dangerous because they do not think the way we think. When most species face superior force, they calculate the odds and surrender or negotiate. Humans do not. They fight anyway. They find ways to win that should not work. They turn every disadvantage into a weapon. Another counselor asked, "But surely this is just desperation. Any species fights hard when their survival is at stake." "It is more than that," Krelnox replied. "I have studied human history. They have spent most of their existence at war. With each other, with their environment, with everything. War is not something they do reluctantly. It is something they understand deeply. They have strategies developed over thousands of years. They have studied every kind of warfare imaginable. When they mobilize for war, they do not improvise. They draw on vast cultural memory." Krelnox showed recordings of human preparations, the factories working around the clock, the civilians volunteering for longer shifts, the unified response across nations that had been enemies for centuries. Look at their industrial capacity. They turned their entire economy to war production in weeks. Every resource, every factory, every person was mobilized, and they sustained this for months without significant unrest. Most species cannot maintain such unity for long periods. The Xanthir had superior numbers, a counselor noted. How did humans overcome that advantage? They refused to fight the kind of battle the Xanthir wanted, Krelnox explained. The Xanthir expected fleet engagements, traditional warfare with formations and tactics they had used successfully before. Humans gave them chaos instead, ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, psychological warfare, and ultimately a trap in the Kepler Nebula that destroyed half the Xanthir fleet. Humans do not care about honor or fighting fairly. They care about winning. Sevrax was quiet for a moment, thinking. What would happen if we went to war with humanity? Krelnox did not hesitate. We would win eventually. Our technology is far superior, and we have resources they cannot match. But the cost would be extraordinary. Humans would fight us the same way they fought the Xanthir. They would attack our supply lines, ambush our ships, and turn every battle into a grinding struggle. They would make occupation impossible, and they would never surrender, not truly. Even if we conquered Earth itself, humans would continue fighting from their colonies. It might take decades or centuries to fully defeat them, and during that time we would lose thousands of ships and millions of lives. The Valtherian Collective has existed for 50,000 years because we are wise enough to avoid unnecessary wars. Fighting humanity would be the definition of an unnecessary war. The council chamber was silent. The Valtherians were long-lived and patient. They had seen countless species rise and fall. But Krelnox's testimony was disturbing. This young species, barely into its space age, had defeated an established empire through sheer determination and tactical brilliance. Should we intervene in this war? Another counselor asked. The Xanthir are weakened. They may seek our help. Krelnox thought carefully before responding. If we intervene on behalf of the Xanthir, humanity will see us as enemies. They do not distinguish between direct threats and those who support their enemies. They will add the Valtherian Collective to their list of opponents. And they will remember. Humans have long memories for enemies. They still remember wars fought on their homeworld thousands of years ago. If we make an enemy of humanity now, that enmity could last for centuries. What do you recommend? Sevrax asked. I recommend we offer mediation, Krelnox said. We should help end this war before it causes more damage. But we should present ourselves as neutral peacemakers, not as supporters of either side. And once peace is established, we should invite humanity to join the Galactic Council as full members. We should treat them as peers, not as primitives. They have earned that respect. The Council debated for hours. Some argued that humanity was too dangerous to be given full membership. Others pointed out that excluding them might create resentment and future conflict. Eventually, a decision was reached. The Valtherian Collective would offer to mediate peace between humanity and the Xanthir Empire. Both sides would be invited to negotiations on neutral ground. Meanwhile, the war continued. The Xanthir Empire was in disarray. The Emperor had lost the support of his military commanders and much of the civilian population. The war that was supposed to be a quick demonstration of power had turned into a disaster. The Empire's economy was strained. Their military was shattered, and they faced an enemy who showed no signs of accepting anything less than complete victory. Human forces began pushing into Xanthir space. They did not attempt to conquer territory. Instead, they destroyed military installations, shipyards, and supply depots. The message was clear. The war would continue until the Xanthir sued for peace on human terms. 3 weeks after the Battle of Kepler, the Xanthir Emperor sent a secret communication to Earth. He requested negotiations. The terms were discussed through intermediaries for days. Finally, an agreement was reached. The Xanthir would formally surrender. They would withdraw from all disputed territories. They would pay reparations to rebuild the colonies they had attacked. They would reduce their military to half its pre-war size, and the Emperor himself would appear before human representatives to sign the treaty. The peace conference was held on a neutral station operated by the Galactic Council. Krelnox observed the proceedings with great interest. The Xanthir delegation looked defeated. Their emperor, who had started the war with such confidence, now appeared old and tired. The military officers who accompanied him avoided eye contact with everyone. The human delegation was led by President Karen Foster, the elected leader of Earth's unified government. She was a calm woman in her 50s with gray hair and steady eyes. She entered the conference room without guards or ceremony, carrying only a datapad with the treaty terms. The signing ceremony was brief and formal. The Xanthir Emperor placed his seal on the treaty document without speaking. His claws trembled slightly. President Foster signed for humanity, her signature firm and clear. Then President Foster spoke, and her words were broadcast across the galaxy. This war should never have happened. The Xanthir Empire threatened human colonies and believed we would submit to superior force. They learned a harsh lesson. Humanity does not submit. We do not surrender. We fight for our homes, our freedom, and our future. We did not seek this war, but we finished it. She paused, looking directly at the Xanthir Emperor. Let this be a lesson to all who might threaten humanity in the future. We are not looking for enemies. We came to the stars seeking knowledge, adventure, and new homes for our people. We want to be part of the galactic community. We want to trade, learn, and grow alongside other species. But if you make us your enemy, you will regret it. President Foster's voice became softer but somehow more intense. We are the children of Earth, a world that tried to kill us in countless ways and failed. We evolved in competition with thousands of predator species. We survived ice ages, plagues, and natural disasters that destroyed most life on our planet. We fought wars among ourselves for 10,000 years, learning every lesson warfare can teach. We built civilizations, destroyed them, and built them again. We reached for the stars not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. That is who we are. We are survivors. We are builders. We are explorers. And we are warriors when we must be. She looked around the room at the assembled galactic representatives. 6 months after the peace treaty was signed, Krelnox returned to Earth for one final visit. The observer had been assigned to other duties, studying different species in distant regions of the galaxy. But before leaving, Krelnox wanted to see how humanity was recovering from the war and adapting to their new status in the galactic community. The changes were remarkable. Earth shipyards, which had been producing warships at incredible speeds during the conflict, were now building exploration vessels and cargo ships. The military-industrial complex was being converted back to civilian production, though at a much slower pace than the original mobilization. Humans had learned from the war. They were keeping a strong military, but they were no longer on a total war footing. Krelnox visited several human colonies that had been attacked during the war. The reconstruction was impressive. New Terra, which had been badly damaged in the first battle, was being rebuilt with improved infrastructure. The colonists who had fled or fought were returning, bringing with them new settlers attracted by stories of human resistance. The colony that had nearly been destroyed was now growing faster than before the war. One conversation particularly interested Krelnox. The observer met with Jack Morrison, the administrator who had defended New Terra during the first battle. Jack had been promoted to regional governor, overseeing several colonies in the outer systems. They met in Jack's office, a simple room decorated with pictures of the colony before and after the war. "How do your people feel about the Xanthir now?" Krelnox asked. "There must be anger, desire for revenge." Jack shook his head. "Some people are angry, sure. We lost friends and family in the war. But most humans understand that the Xanthir were following their emperor's orders. The soldiers who attacked us were just doing their duty. Now the war is over, and we need to move forward. Holding grudges doesn't help anyone." "That is remarkably forgiving," Krelnox observed. "We're practical," Jack explained. "Humans have fought so many wars throughout our history that we've learned some lessons. One lesson is that wars end eventually, and you have to live with your former enemies afterward. Earth had 2 massive world wars in the 20th century. Millions died. But the nations that fought those wars are now allies and trading partners. We remember the past, but we don't let it control our future." Krelnox found this fascinating. Most species held onto enmity for generations. The humans, who had fought so fiercely, were now willing to forgive and cooperate with their former enemies. It seemed contradictory, but perhaps it was another aspect of their practical nature. The observer also visited Earth's military academy, where the next generation of human officers was being trained. The curriculum had been updated based on lessons learned from the war. Krelnox attended a lecture given by Admiral Richard Cole, the commander who had won the Battle of Kepler. Cole was teaching cadets about strategic thinking. "The Xanthir lost because they were predictable," he explained. "They had doctrines and procedures that had worked in previous wars, so they kept using them. We won because we were flexible. When something didn't work, we tried something else. When the enemy adapted, we adapted faster. That's the key to military success. Never stop learning, never stop adapting." A cadet asked about the ethics of some human tactics. "Sir, we used a lot of deception during the war. We set traps, used decoys, and attacked supply lines. Some species consider those tactics dishonorable. How do we balance military effectiveness with ethical behavior?" Cole's response was thoughtful. "War is never honorable. Anyone who romanticizes combat has never experienced it. When your survival is at stake, you use every advantage you can find. But there are limits. We don't target civilians deliberately. We don't torture prisoners. We follow the rules of war that humanity agreed to centuries ago. Within those rules, we fight as effectively as possible. The goal is to win quickly and decisively, which actually minimizes suffering in the long run. A short, brutal war is better than a long, drawn-out conflict that kills more people on both sides." Krelnox appreciated this perspective. Humans were not mindlessly aggressive. They thought carefully about violence and its consequences. They simply accepted war as a sometimes necessary tool, rather than as something to be avoided at all costs. The observer also attended meetings of the Galactic Council, where human representatives were participating for the first time as full members. President Foster had appointed an experienced diplomat named Ambassador Helen Carter to represent humanity. Helen was skilled at navigating the complex politics of the Council, forming alliances and proposing compromise solutions to disputes. One contentious issue involved a territorial dispute between 2 minor species. The argument had been ongoing for decades without resolution. Both sides claimed the same star system, and neither would back down. The Council had tried mediation repeatedly without success. Ambassador Carter proposed a novel solution. Why not share the system? Both species could establish colonies on different planets. They could trade with each other, share resources, and benefit from cooperation. Fighting over territory is expensive and destructive. Working together is profitable for everyone. The 2 species were skeptical at first, but Carter worked patiently to address their concerns. She pointed out that humanity had learned this lesson the hard way, fighting wars on Earth for thousands of years before finally learning to cooperate. She offered to have human mediators help establish the joint administration of the system. Eventually, both species agreed to try Carter's proposal. Krelnox was impressed. Humans were not just warriors. They were also skilled diplomats who understood cooperation and compromise. They brought a fresh perspective to the Council, unbound by the traditions and ancient rivalries that complicated relationships between older species. The observer's final stop was a memorial service on Earth. Humanity was dedicating a monument to the people who had died during the war. The monument was a simple black wall with thousands of names carved into it, located in what humans called Washington. Krelnox attended the ceremony, standing in the crowd of humans who had come to remember their dead. President Foster spoke at the ceremony. We gather today to honor those who gave their lives defending humanity. They came from every nation on Earth and every colony in space. They were soldiers and civilians, young and old, volunteers and career military. They had different backgrounds, different beliefs, different dreams, but they shared one thing: the determination to protect our future. She paused, looking at the long wall of names. Some people ask me if the war was worth the cost. That's not an easy question to answer. We lost thousands of good people. Families were torn apart. Lives were changed forever. But I know what we would have lost if we had surrendered. We would have lost our freedom, our dignity, and our right to determine our own future. The people whose names are on this wall died so that humanity could remain free. Their sacrifice was not in vain. Foster continued, her voice strong. We will remember them. We will tell our children about their courage. We will honor their memory by building the kind of society they fought to protect. A society that explores the stars, that welcomes newcomers, that stands up for what is right. We will make sure that their sacrifice meant something. After the ceremony, Krellnox encountered a human veteran standing before the memorial. It was Scott Turner, the pilot who had survived the Battle of Kepler after his entire squadron was destroyed. Scott was looking at a section of the wall where several names were grouped together. His squadron, Krellnox realized. The observer approached carefully. I remember you, Krellnox said. You were interviewed before deploying to the outer colonies. Scott turned, his expression sad but not bitter. Yeah, I remember that interview. I said some brave things about standing up to bullies. Seemed simple at the time. Do you regret fighting? Krellnox asked. Scott thought about the question for a long moment. I regret that we had to fight. I regret losing my friends. I regret all the pain and death. But I don't regret defending my home. These people, he gestured at the names on the wall, they died for something important. For their families, for their freedom, for the future. That matters. How did you do it? Krellnox asked. How did your species endure such losses and keep fighting? Scott looked at the memorial again. Because we knew that if we didn't, there wouldn't be anyone left to remember them. We fought for the people we lost. For our families. For the future. For every human not yet born, who deserves a chance to live in a universe where we're not slaves or victims. That's what kept us going. He turned to face Krellnox directly. You asked me once what makes humans different. I think I understand it better now. We're not the strongest species. We're not the smartest. We're definitely not the most advanced. But we're stubborn. We're the species that looks at impossible odds and says, watch me. We fall down 7 times and stand up 8. We're survivors in a universe that has tried repeatedly to kill us off. Scott smiled, though tears were visible in his eyes. And that makes us dangerous, because you can destroy our ships, occupy our worlds, and kill our soldiers. But you cannot kill the human spirit. As long as that spirit endures, we'll keep fighting, keep building, and keep reaching for the stars.